Morning, everyone. Welcome to a new session in our seminar. And this morning, our speaker is Shlomi Efrati. Shlomi, he holds a PhD degree from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he wrote a dissertation on the Pesicata of 10 Commandments, text redaction and tradition analysis, under the supervision of Professor Menahim Kister. In 2019, he joined the Scripta Qumranica Electronica project at Haifa University as a postdoctoral collaborator, and a year later, he was selected to work in the Text Evolve project of Professor Hector Patmore, which examines manuscripts of the Targum, being Jewish Aramaic paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible, at the Research Unit Biblical Studies in the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at the KAI Leuven. Shlomi's research interests include rabbinic literature as well as early Judaism, including Qumran literature and so-called pseudepigrapha, and medieval, halakhic, and other writings. He has published several articles on these topics, and most recently also collaborated with Professor Michael Stone to publish the Armenian Genesis commentary of Stepanos of Sionik in the prestigious CSCO series. Shlomi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this generous introduction and generous invitation. And one small comment, the volume in CSO, the Genesis commentary, perhaps attributed to Stepanos of Sionik. For more information, look in the introduction. And now I will step directly into my paper. In my talk today, I would like to present and examine some disturbing phenomena from the textual history of rabbinic literature. They are disturbing because, first of all, they are not easy to explain. And second, because they are challenging the very basic idea of what constitutes a concrete text. I will present a few case studies, as time allows, from the Babylonian Talmud, where textual variants within the Talmud turn out to be intrinsically related to parallel versions in other rabbinic compositions. Thus, the distinction between these parallel compositions becomes somewhat blurry, and during my talk, I will try to clarify somewhat better what this blurry means. And moreover, the textual study turns into source criticism, and the examination of the transmission of the Talmudic text becomes, to some extent, a study of the final reduction and formation of the Talmud. All of this, I hope, will become clearer through the discussion of the specific examples. But before that, I would like to offer a very short introduction on the Babylonian Talmud and the unique textual witness that will be the focus of my talk. So, the Babylonian Talmud, and henceforth the Bavli for abbreviation, is a vast compilation of legal discussions, biblical interpretations, wisdom sayings, legends and folktales, proverbs, medical recipes, and various other materials collected and created by the Jewish sages in Babylonia. The sages mentioned by name in the Bavli were active during the 3rd up to around the 5th century CE, give or take, in the two rabbinic centers of that time in Palestine and Babylonia. However, it is possible that the processes of the compilation and reduction of the Bavli as a complete entity, processes concerning which we know very little, were not accomplished until quite later, perhaps up until the 7th century CE. The Bavli, like most rabbinic compositions, is a collection rather than a composition. It quotes various sources and sayings and organizes them into more or less coherent continuums, without attempting to merge the discrete units into a single homogeneous text. Last but not least, the source material or the building blocks of the Bavli, and again, like rabbinic literature in general, are oral traditions, memorized by heart and presumably not written or not quoted from written sources. The Bavli itself is presented as part and parcel of this oral tradition and seems to have been composed and initially transmitted orally. This has serious implications on the understanding and evaluation of the abundance of its textual variants. Now, coming to textual variants. To a certain extent, awareness to and engagement with textual variants is already apparent within the Bavli itself. And even its earliest commentators were sometimes troubled with problems of conflicting versions. Modern scholars tried to produce a more systematic textual approach, but it was soon realized that classic conceptions of textual criticism cannot easily be applied to Talmudic materials. And again, the same is true for rabbinic compositions more generally. Many of the textual variants in the Bavli cannot be explained as normal copying mistakes, but rather reflect an essential fluidity or instability of the Talmudic text itself. I will demonstrate this type of variants by examples from Tractate Sanhedrin of the Bavli, drawn from a study of a unique, highly interesting, and unfortunately very fragmentary textual witness of the last chapter of the tractate. Elsewhere, I have dedicated a detailed study for the unusual, sometimes even bizarre, codicological and textual features of this witness, published in Tarbitz in Hebrew in 2 parts. And henceforth, I will refer to this witness as G, and will distinguish it from the common text of Bavli Sanhedrin, which is represented in most of the manuscripts in the printed edition. Let us then have a look at the texts themselves. I will present all the sources in a presentation on the screen, but they are also found in your handouts if you would like to consult them further. Georgia, I would like now to show my presentation. Thank you. So, the first example that we will deal with concerns a dispute between 2 Palestinian sages concerning the righteousness of Noah. The dispute is recorded both in the Bavli and in the Palestinian composition Bereshit Rabbah, which may have been composed by the first half of the 5th century CE. For reasons that will become clear during the discussion, I will present first the version of Bereshit Rabbah, now on your screen. According to this version, source 1 in the handout, the 2 Palestinian sages, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah, were divided in the interpretation of the qualification, Noah was righteous in his generations. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it means that Noah is righteous only in relation to his wicked contemporaries, like a sourish wine, which is better than sour wine, but, of course, much less desirable than proper wine. On the other hand, Rabbi Nehemiah claims that Noah's righteousness was so great exactly because he managed to be righteous amidst his wicked fellows in his generations. In this respect, Noah is likened to a perfume that gives good smell even when it is tightly closed and deposited amidst grapes, where the stench of corpses is strongest. To appreciate this last parable, I should add that first, it has been customary among Palestinian Jews, as in other parts of the Greco-Roman world, to deposit various grave goods with the dead, including small containers of perfumed oil. Second, the common burial practice in Palestine was in burial caves, not in shaft graves. And it may be imagined what kind of smell prevailed in such places, in these caves where the corpses lay actually exposed to the air. Thus, Bereshit Rabbah offers an exegetical dispute, accompanied by 2 realistic parables or similes. When we move to the Bavli, we find the same basic structure of 2 opinions and 2 parables, though here they are ordered differently, attributed to other Palestinian sages, and spelled out in a somewhat different form than in the Bereshit Rabbah. All of these are the common changes between the Bavli and its parallels. Let us examine first the version of the dispute in Manuscript G of the Bavli, is source 2 in the handout. It begins with introducing the 2 diverging opinions, here attributed to Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish, again, 2 Palestinian sages. Rabbi Yochanan said Noah was righteous in his generations and not in other generations. And Resh Lakish said, in his generations, how much more so in other generations would have Noah been righteous? Understood. These are the same opinions that we saw in Bereshit Rabbah, but there they were attributed to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah, respectively. The Babli's version is more concise, but there is no real change in the content of their opinions. Now the Babyl's version illustrates each of these opinions with an appropriate parable, attributed to yet again another couple of Palestinian sages. First, Bar Chafina, which is probably a corruption for Rabbi Hanina. We'll see it in the other version. Anyway, Bar Chafina said, as an illustration of Rabbi Yochanan's view, to what may this be compared? To a barrel of wine which became sourish in a vault of sour wine. In a place of wine, it is sour, but in a place of sour, it is wine. Rabbi Oshaya said, as an illustration of Resh Lakish's view, to what may this be compared? To a phial of perfume lying in the graveyard and its odor exudes. In a place of impurity, its odor exudes. How much more so in a place of purity? The parables are similar in content to those in Bereshit Rabbah, but more formulaic, and both cast in a similar structure. Something in place X is A, but in place Y, it is not A. The content of the first parable, the wine that became sourish in a vault of sour wine, is in fact identical to the first parable in Bereshit Rabbah. An interesting detail in this parable is the exact definition of the wine, which is in the process of turning sour, but is not yet completely sour. In Bereshit Rabbah, on the bottom of the slide, in Bereshit Rabbah, this wine is called koses, which is a usual term in Palestinian sources. In the version of Manuscript G, on the other hand, the sourish wine is called hikris, which again is a common term for this matter in the Bavli. Thus, we can say that the first parable went a terminological translation without seriously altering its meaning. The second parable in the Bavli offers a parable of a phial of perfume in a graveyard, which is a place of impurity. Again, in essence, it is identical to the second parable from Bereshit Rabbah. However, the wording of the Bavli's version could give rise to some confusion. It seems to suppose that a phial of perfume would give forth its odor in a place of purity much more than in a place of impurity. Yet the relationship between giving smell and impurity is not self-evident. Actually, we have to understand that a place of impurity is a graveyard, and the graveyard is a place of stench, and therefore it is remarkable that the phial of perfume gives or exudes its smell in this place of impurity. But all of this is somewhat implicit in the Bavli's version. So far, it seems that the differences between the version of the Bavli and that of Bereshit Rabbah concern style, terminology, but not the content of the tradition. However, a different picture arises when we turn to examine the parables in the common version of the Babli Sanhedrin. According to this version, and again, I'm focusing only on the parables, there is a perfect symmetry between the two parables. Both share exactly the same formula. To what may this be compared? To something lying in this place. In this place, its odor exudes, but in another place, and here, of course, the symmetry breaks off because each parable have a contradicting or another different end. However, the elegant and symmetrical structure comes at the expense of clarity and accuracy of content. The first parable claims that a barrel of wine gives out its good smell, supposedly, in a vault of sour, but not outside of it. This is hardly likely. Sour wine is much more odorous than wine, and hence a barrel of wine in a vault of sour will likely not be felt at all, or at least not felt too much. Perhaps the meaning is that the smell of a barrel of wine is distinct in a vault of sour, whereas outside of it, there is nothing special about this wine. Still, the wording is vague. It seems that the motif of exuding odor was taken up from the parable of the perfume in the graveyard and forcefully incorporated onto the wine parable, yielding a rather improbable image, or at least an inaccurate wording. And I skipped the slide, of course. As for the second parable, it too is somewhat unclear. It describes a phial of perfume that gives forth its odor in a place of filth, how much more so in a place of spices. The association of perfume with filth and spices seems natural, but the logic of the argument is somewhat opaque. Why would odor exude more in a place of spices than in a place of filth? Wouldn't the spices conceal the smell of that one phial of perfume just as much or even more than the stench of filth? It may be that this version introduced the contrast filth spices as a simple and almost mechanical replacement of the contrast impurity and purity that we saw in the version of Manuscript G. As I mentioned earlier, the relationship between perfume and impurity is not self-evident, and it was only natural that a contrast impurity purity was replaced or reinterpreted by the contrast filth perfume, which is more natural in the context of malfactory context. Yet the terminological improvement came at the cost of logical clarity, and what's more important, completely detached the perfume parable from the context of graveyards and grave goods, as a phial of perfume lying in the graveyard became a phial of perfume lying in a place of filth, an undefined place of filth. The relation between G and the common version of Babli Sanhedrin, in this case, seems clear. G preserves an original version that was reworked and developed in the common version. The scope and intensity of this reworking are quite impressive and not very common. The interesting thing here is the relation between these versions and the parallel tradition in Bereshit Rabbah. As we have seen, the parallel in Bereshit Rabbah is almost identical in content to version G. The common version differs from both. Had we had only the common version of Babli Sanhedrin at our disposal, we would assume that the differences between this version and the version of Bereshit Rabbah represent the differences between these two compositions, perhaps also reflecting various realistic differences between the Palestinian and Babylonian milieus concerning the production of wine or burial practices. Version G teaches that these differences, rather than showing the Babylonian adaptation of a Palestinian source, actually reflect an inner Babylonian, one may say, literary development. And now I'm getting to my conclusion, and Georgia, I can stop sharing. To be sure, in the preceding discussion, I presented a rather extreme case of dissimilarity between G and the common version of the Babli. Not the most extreme, but surely one of them. To appreciate the relationship between these two versions, it must equally be emphasized that in most of its text, G is virtually identical to the common version. Thus, we're not dealing here with two Bablis. Even speaking about two recensions of the Babli might be going too far, though this also depends, of course, on what one defines as recension. G and the common version both present basically the same Talmudic text. However, the type of variant they exhibit seem to reflect or stem from a stage in the development of this text when the arrangement of the Talmud is completed and its text largely fixed, but not entirely. To a certain extent, at certain points, the transmitters of the text were able and perhaps obliged to fix its exact wording, to flesh it out, maybe also to choose between alternate versions, thus giving it, the Talmudic text, a final and complete form. This process of, let's call it editorial transmission, has implications for evaluating the relationship between different parallel compositions, as we have seen. The different versions of the dispute over Noah's righteousness demonstrate how a Palestinian literary unit was first translated, then later transformed in the context of the Babli. The common version of the Babli presents a version that seems to be quite far removed from its Palestinian parallel. But what seems to be two geographically distinct versions is probably the result of an inner Babylonian development. This example shows that processes of reformulation and reinterpretation may occur during the textual history of a single composition, thus adding another layer of complexity to the already complicated question of the Babli's use and adaptation of Palestinian sources. And I'll be happy to speak more about this in the following discussion. Speaking more generally, this example demonstrates how parallel versions could go on developing next to each other and sometimes in relation to each other, long after they were incorporated into their respective, seemingly discrete compositions. The specific, minute details of these texts were, at least in some cases, very much dependent on their transmission, and thus oblige us to be much more cautious when thinking about the text of the Babli, or of any rabbinic composition for that matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shlomi, for this very interesting presentation. We are now opening the floor to questions and start our Q&A session, so you can raise your hand or just write in the chat and we'll come to you. Yeah, I see Andy has a question already.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shlomi. It's a very, very interesting tradition. Very interesting tradition. I have no experience with this whatsoever. So yours was sort of my introduction into all of this. So it sounds fascinating. So maybe, in the danger of asking maybe stupid questions, maybe a very general question to start with, these type of parallel traditions that you are working on. So you mentioned this Manuscript G, but how common are these? Are we talking like in the tens, or are there many more about, or is it just, was the let's call it the traditional, with the common version? I assume it was the most popular one, but how popular were the parallel ones in terms of manuscripts that have come down?
Well, to judge according to the material at our disposal, which is the only thing we can do, not at all. I mean, it seems by and large, G is a sui generis. And most of his unique versions are literally unique. He's the only one to produce them. That being said, again, this is the larger picture when you start to look in details, and this is most of what I've done in my work of this manuscript was looking into details. Then here and there you can find, how would I say, points of contacts between G and other witnesses of Babli Sanhedrin. By the way, just so you be in another picture, we're talking about 5 complete or more or less complete witnesses of Babli Sanhedrin. Okay, so this is not a huge textual tradition. This is the normal situation when dealing with rabbinic compositions. If you have 10 manuscripts, then wow, it's expressive. But sorry. So sometimes we do find, let's say, points of contact between G and, or let's say, the textual tradition of G and these or other manuscripts. Not always the same one. So there are points of contact with one of the Oriental manuscript of Sanhedrin, which itself exhibits, let's say, specific branch of the common version. But on the other hand, I've also found very interesting textual shred from that is found actually apparently a corrupt version that we found in G, and is somehow hinted also in an Ashkenazi, in the European witness. So apparently this textual, or the textual tradition behind G, had circulated more widely. We simply don't possess its witnesses, and we can, I mean, it seems safe to assume that it was much less popular. Why? And now we can, of course, start guessing or start create our stories about the textual transmission of the Babli and the relationship between the different schools in Babylonia and the different Jewish communities in late antiquity, early Middle Ages. Again, we know very little. I said that we know very little about the process of the reduction of the bubbly. We also know only a bit more about the dissemination of the bubbly from, let's say, from Babylon to the other communities, where there are processes of canonization or attempts to produce a coherent or a unified or a single text. Well, there were attempts to, apparently they weren't necessarily very successful, but by and large, we possess, let's say, one textual tradition of the bubbly with many deviant echoes coming from here and there. So G is, first of all, it's a relatively, I mean, quite a lot is preserved of it, and second, it's quite outstanding. So it's somewhat stronger echo of this other tradition that were there, but we don't really know what were the actual actually wide circulate this tradition was.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Shlomi. Thanks, Sandy, for the question. We have a question from Donna now.
Oh, thank you so much, Shlomi. I will second Andy saying this is totally new sources to me. I'm entirely unfamiliar, you know, the cobbler goes barefoot. But it really resonated for me, somewhat similar, an analogous thing that maybe it's not so analogous, I'll tell you, where you have Koses and L'Hakris. You mentioned that two different terminological, different terminological choices or roots. And you opened by saying that the Talmud is a compilatory, that you have, which is very important, like almost encyclopedic, and that I'm always imagining pools of traditions. So you have a pool of a Noach tradition, and it appears sometimes in Bereshit Rabbah, and I wouldn't, you know, so you're mentioning different manuscripts, but I would say different like dialects or strands of this Noach tradition or other traditions. And just to give another example, to think that this happens a lot in texts, like you have the Palestinian and Babylonian way of presenting it. In a different context, I'm reminded very strongly of a certain description which has a peripatetic, I'm talking about Greek, a certain description of the speech acts. This comes way before Austin, it comes in Aristotle. And you have, I would say, peripatetic treatment of it, and you have a Stoic treatment of it, and they use different. They have a difference in terminology, and when you take this to Arabic, medieval Arabic translations, sometimes the medieval Arabic translation of this list resonates from the Stoic, the use of the Stoic. I don't know if you want, I can give an example. Terms and sometimes the peripatetic terms, like following Aristotle's terms directly, in the translation reflect that choice of words, or does it reflect the different, somewhat variant choice of words? They're saying the same thing more or less, but they're choosing different things, and it's like different, like parallel traditions that go on and on. I don't know if this is helpful to you, or perhaps to say it's not so much a manuscript thing, it's more a strand of the tradition possible. So I was very much happy to see this example. It resonated for me.
First of all, I think I'm less acquainted with the Arabic tradition of Greek philosophy than you were acquainted with rabbinic composition, rabbinic literature. I mean, I'm sure I'm less familiar. My first question, actually I have a question to you. Are the translators consistent with their rendering? And
what I'm saying is that
do they apply peripatetic Arabic terms to peripatetic Greek sources, or is it also fully dependent on the tradition of the translator? So you will translate peripatetically whatever source is translating. Okay,
this gets fascinating. There's somewhat of a crossover. If you go to the mainstream Arabic, and nobody's mainstream, but you go, Abu Bishr Mata translating the Poetics, I'm talking, I did this on the Poetics book 919, I think. He has one set of terms which are similar to Aristotle's terms and similar somewhat to Dionysius terms, but different from the Stoic terms. And then this the Arabic translation of Aristotle uses terms that sound okay, but as soon as you go to the derivatives, you go to Ibn Sina, you go to Ibn Rushd, who give treatments of this. And specifically, if you go to the Judeo, if you go to Saadia Gaon, he's using the peripatetic ones because he is drawing on possibly on Mu'tazili Karaite things. I didn't go so deep in that. I'm not knowledgeable enough in the Judeo, but there's like a switch. At some point, you get some translations which are different and may possibly more reflect, resonate from what's used in the Stoic presentation of what is basically a very similar idea. There's a little bit overlap. There is no strict consistency, but it's mostly peripatetic.
Thank you. Thanks to both. I have a related question, which is from these differences that you pointed out, can we see, of course, not only from this example, but can we also identify schools of thought or like consistent approaches? Of course, not like Stoicism or Aristotelian thought, but can we, from an outsider, question from an outsider?
Great question. That was one of the larger questions that I had and still have when working on this manuscript. And again, I'm speaking time and again to G, because you need to have a stretch of material in order to be able to say something about the about consistency or about some approach, etc. And I will let's say, in parentheses, variants of this kind are rather rare in general, and we mainly find them in fragments from the Cairo Geniza, the large storehouse. Okay, many of you know this. Yeah, the large storehouse of used, let's say, Jewish literature found in Cairo, and much of the material there is awfully fragmentary. If you find a complete page, that's again huge success. So in many cases, all that we have from when all that we have from a different textual tradition is have a mutilated page. You can't say too much about approach or about consistency. In G, we can say a bit more. Unfortunately, not much. By and large, I can't say that it has any stance or any bias or any ideology in his. It's not his. In the textual tradition that it represents, or the common version, the same. The two main characteristics that I could make with, in general speaking, is first, the common version tends more to be a bit more expansive, or to have more expansions, or we can say that glosses, or not really glosses, but pluses in relation to G in the Talmudic text. And when I say glosses, this is not simply that the Talmudic text is longer. This is not simply saying the same thing with more words, but actually, let's say, adding a clause, adding an explanation, a bit of, sometimes even adding a bit of tradition, etc. So it expresses in various ways, but it seems that the common version tended more to expand or to add to the Talmudic text in relation to G. Now, this is not, G itself has its own expansions here and there. But again, if you ask about the content of these expansions, then of any kind, So again, you can't say that I see here any ideological stand. There perhaps a literary inclination. That's one. A second trait is that especially when comparing legal sections of the preserved material, it seems that both each tradition, I mean G on the one hand and the common version on the other, develops these materials in slightly different ways. And this is actually what I hinted when I say that the transmitters were obliged to interfere in the material, because I assume, well, not only I, one of the assumptions of several scholars is that at a certain early stage of the Talmudic text, it contained, let's say, a nucleus or only partly developed, mainly legal discussions, or at least that the discussions of legal materials were not fully developed, but they contained hints or instructions for the students to develop the material. And what we see in G and in the common version are, I mean, some of the differences between G and the common version may be explained as different interpretations or different developments of these more nucleus hypothetical stage. And in these cases, it seems that the G attempts, or again, the textual tradition of G attempts to develop or to flesh out the discussion on the basis of the material available in the Bavli itself, or in its, let's say, immediate context, while the common version tends more to import material from other parts of the Talmud. And I should add that the Talmud constantly refers to itself. Again, this is one of the most basic characteristics of Rabbinic composition. It's self-referential. Of course, you have to know where the Talmud refers to, because many of the references are quite implicit or opaque. And in speaking about back to Bavli 17, the common version seems more you say either aware or makes more use of these self-referential characteristics. So it will, for instance, if you have a problem where you have to supply the have a problem, an answer, and then you have to add the explanation of the answer. So the answer is given, but the explanation, or the final explanation of why this answer was chosen, is different in each tradition. So G will supply an explanation that is taken from the immediate material, and the common version will import some more, let's say, a general or well-known legal conception that was not mentioned until now in the immediate discussion. But it's still relevant. Again, we can see here a different, how would I say, approach to how to deal with, how to form, complete the text. And again, I think it has to do more with literary or method of study, actually, than with ideology or theology.
Yes, I see. Thanks a lot for this. But no, it's interesting because in any case, you can see differences, but of course, of another kind. So it's really, yeah, thank you for that. Do we have, yes, we have another question from Georgia, I think.
I see that also Handy has one. So if it's related to was okay, then I'll.
It was just maybe to mention that maybe it would be a good time to, because you have the other example on your handout, and maybe it fits into what you just said. I don't know.
Yeah, that was exactly what I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, that was my question. So if it's, yeah.
It's not, well, it will, I will be very happy to introduce it. This is why it's on the handout. It will exemplify at different form. So I didn't include here examples that relate to legal material because they're mainly extremely difficult. So I will probably need the complete session only to introduce the legal assumptions before we even get into the textual variants themselves. Okay, one more comment in parentheses. I mentioned that the variant we saw is not the most extreme. The most extreme example is from actually another tractate, another chapter from Megillah, which is also preserved in G. And there we have a complete legal discussion, sugya in Aramaic, which is developed in completely different ways in the common version and in G. Which is extremely unique. It happens only in this case for the whole manuscript that is preserved. But well, again, this is probably a complete seminar, not a one talk to present it. But anyway, if you're still interested in the second example, there again it presented another phenomenon of relationship between the Bavli and its parallels, or in this case, actually the Babylonian and its sources. Sorry, don't have a presentation, so I encourage you all to turn to your handouts.
If you want to share the handout, or if you want one of us to share the screen with the handout, go ahead.
Let's see if we can. Yeah, I'll share it from here. It's not a problem. No, sorry. Sorry, this happens when you're not fully prepared. Georgia, so could you give permission to that
it's
for me?
open. Yeah, it's open. It's open.
Okay, so let's see. Sorry, this is taking so long. Yes. Okay, so so here we have also the Hebrew version. So my second example deals with it again related to the flood, and it concerns a correlation between sin and punishment of such generation of the flood. First of all, I will introduce it as it appears in the common version on the left column of the table. Rabbi Yosef ben Dumaskit said, or Rabbi Yosef son of the Damaskian said, the generation of the flood waxed haughty only on account of the eyeball, which is like water. Skip a little. Therefore, he, the one above, judged or punished them by water, which is like the eyeball. As it is written, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. Rabbi Yosef ben Dumaskit uses here a kind of literary eye for an eye principle. Just like the eye is similar to water, so it is a sin. Walking after one's eyes and lust is similar to its punishment, the drowning in water. Apparently, the eyeball is like water because both are bright and transparent and wet, though the similarity is somewhat general. In version G, sorry, what I still needs to mention is that the very similar version to what we found in the common version of the Bavli is found in an earlier source in the Tosefta, including the equation of eye and water. Moving now to Manuscript G on the right-hand column of the table, it offers a somewhat different version of this unit. In addition to many changes in the exact formulation and in the choice of biblical proofs, which I would not go into, the I similes in Manuscript G are different. In the first part, we are told that the generation of the flood waxed haughty only on account of the sun, Galgal Chama, which is like the I. Now, likening of sun and I is quite common in other contexts, but here, the mention of the sun seems out of place, and the reading is probably corrupt. However, it seems unlikely that the equation of an I to the ball of the sun, Galgal Chama, results from a version that equated the I with water. The corrupted reading probably reflects a different version than the common version. By the way, I will add here that this Chama, this probably corrupt version, appears again in one Ashkenazi witness. A very bad witness, but it has sometimes interesting text. Okay, now back to G and to the scene of the generation of the flood. In the second part of the unit, God rebukes the sinners and proclaims, "Fools, is it not that you wax haughty only on account of the eyeball, which is like a fountain?" Now, the pun in this last sentence is lost in translation, which is exactly the same Hebrew word, ayin, that stands at both ends of the simile, meaning both eye and fountain. And I invite you to have a look later in source 8 in the handout, where you will see exactly the same simile in the Syriac proverbs of Achikal. At any rate, this, version G, seems to be a much sharper simile than a general I is like water of the common version. Now, generally speaking, version G in this unit is still very close to the common version of the Bavli, and therefore also to the Tosefta just mentioned. However, the likening of the eye to a fountain appears in another early version of this unit, in source number 7, in early Midrash collections on Exodus and Deuteronomy, known as Mechilta and Sifrei, respectively. I will refer to them as the Midrash collections. So here we read, "They gave their eyes, the upper in the lower, to do their desire. And the Lord opened on them fountains from above and from below in order to destroy them." According to this version, the generation of the flood seen in Einaim, eyes, they gave their upper eye, the seeing and lasting eye, in the lower eye, probably a euphemism for feminine pudenda. Therefore, they were punished by ma'ayanot, fountains, from above and below. Thus, while the common version of the Bavli offers an eye simile, which is close to the Tosefta, version G is closer in this respect to the Midrashi collections on Exodus and Deuteronomy. The material difference between these two versions is slight. Mine instead of ein is a two short Hebrew word. However, as stated earlier, there are further differences between G and the common version. It is possible that these differences represent not so much the fluidity of the Talmudic text itself, but rather different sources or different versions of the textual unit that were utilized by G on the one hand, and the common version on the other hand. To put it in different words, it is possible that different transmitters of the Bavli incorporated different versions of this source of the I simile into the Talmud, each transmitter citing the version known to him. In this case, what looks like textual variant of the Talmudic text may actually reflect different versions of the source used by the Talmud. So if in the unit of Noah's generation, the righteousness of Noah, we saw a unit incorporated in the Talmud and then presumably being developed within the Talmud, here what we may have is, or actually are, two versions of a Tanaitic source, of an early source, that are almost identical, but not exactly. In each version, that G on the tradition of G on the one hand, the tradition of the common version on the other, each version quotes a different version. So this is not transmitters that change the text they're citing for whatever reason, but transmitters that know, each of them memorizes or knows by heart a different version of this source, and when each of them come to this part, and this part they know, maybe even they have some instructions saying, now quote this in Tosefta, so they quote this in Tosefta faithfully, but each according to his own tradition. Which, well, again, on the theoretical level, of course, raises the question, so are we dealing here with a text of the Babli? Are we dealing here with a text of a Tanaitic source in the Babli? It also raises the question of how to evaluate differences between Babylonian Talmud and the Tanaitic sources that we find in other compositions. Are these changes made by the, let's say, reductors of the Babylonian Talmud, as is many times claimed, and again, with good reasons, or are these changes as a result of, let's say, earlier textual developments, and the Talmud simply quotes the Tanaitic sources available to it. Or again, and the Talmud quotes who is quoting. These are reductors of the Talmud, the transmitters of the Talmud. I'm raising these questions. I'm merely presenting these questions. I'm not trying to say that I know the answers, only demonstrating the complexity of this situation.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks a lot for this really interesting other example. Do we have other questions, or if we don't have any other question, I think we thank again Shlomi for this very interesting presentation, and we'll see again to our next TeTra meeting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this, for inviting me. Thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day.